Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Leonard or Lenny Gronda. I'm a professor here at ETSU, and I teach ASL and ASL minor. I'm introducing this topic about deaf and American Sign Language issues. There's several different issues that impact the deaf community and deaf people here in this area locally in the Tri-Cities. I identify myself as deaf. I became deaf at age 4. I had spinal meningitis, and I became deaf shortly. And shortly after I became deaf, I went into a mainstream school program where they had signing, and I learned sign language there. And at that time, it was more like when, signed English at that time. But I learned, as I was going along, I learned English, I learned sign language. It was sort of before kindergarten. And I was a proud member of the Tri-Cities deaf community. Here I am. So I identify myself and my culture as culturally deaf, not just audiologically deaf, but I identify as culturally deaf. 120 decibel loss, so I'm profoundly deaf, but I'm also culturally deaf. I have my bachelor's in history from Gallaudet University. That's in Washington, D.C. That's the only deaf university in the world. And I got my master's degree in education of the deaf from San Diego State University. Using ASL and English in a dual manner to teach deaf children how to read, and then also my educational doctorate from university in education, deaf education. Deaf, yeah, it should say deaf, not dead. The captions are wrong. I taught deaf students there in Massachusetts there, and at the deaf school, and I taught elementary, maybe 3rd to 4th grade deaf children. And I taught ASL from probably kindergarten all the way through college at very different levels. I've got experience teaching it to all different things, and then college students too. My research mainly focused on using multiple language approach for deaf and immigrants in reading and improving their reading skills, and early language acquisition using ASL and English in a bilingual approach, and also about language deprivation for deaf children. So I'm a strong advocate for deaf communities and deaf education and communication access, having both. Just to let you know, soon on March 13th through April 15th, it's National Deaf History Month. Say, why is it March 13th through the April 15th? That's because March 13th, 1988, that was at Gallaudet University. And for the history of that university, almost over 100 years, they had only had hearing presidents of that university at Gallaudet University. So they finally elected their first deaf president. They chose their first deaf president named I. King Jordan. That was the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. So that was sort of a historical moment. So that's why March 13th, and it continues till April 15th. Why? Because ASL 1817, it was in American Sign Language mainstream for the deaf children, opened in Hartford, Connecticut, the first deaf school. And now today, as an American school for the deaf, it's still in still running today. So that was the first deaf school there in Connecticut. And that's why it sort of explains a lot of the history that we have now. So I hope you'll learn with me. I love doing history because my bachelor's is in history, so I love to explain about history and the deaf history. So explain about American deaf history, you have to go back a little bit earlier. In Europe, there was a man named Ponce de Leon, maybe about 1500s, and he taught deaf people there at a monastery, and they were focused on reading lips. And later, in Juan Pablo Bonet, he was a Spanish educator, and he took a look at different ways in suggesting how people learn visually and learning letters that are printed and using finger spelling, using a manual alphabet and learning lip reading and sort of learning how to teach lip reading. And he published the first about the simplification of letters and the art of teaching the mute to speak. That was in 1620. That was the first recorded illustration of finger spelling, where they wrote down the little pictures of the hands. At that time, mostly the rich or affluent families could have their deaf children learn, and because they would have to send them to the school for them to learn. So it was mostly private school. By the late 1700s, there were some private and public schools established in England, also in Scotland. They taught mostly the oral method. However, students were permitted to use gestures and sort of natural sign language until they were able to learn how to speak verbally. 1778, Germany established the first school for the deaf, and they rejected the use of sign language since they believed that it hindered the acquisition of spoken language. And since that time, research has proven that that's not true. A long time ago, they were kind of clueless and they didn't really know any better. So in France, there was a man by the name of Abbe Charles Michael D. Ippy, and this is his sign name. This is his sign name like this. He established the first deaf school in Paris, France. It was called the National Institute for Deaf Mutes. And that was the first free national school for the deaf in the world, 1760. Later, he published a few books about educating the deaf and also the first dictionary of French Sign Language. Contrary to popular belief, he did not invent sign language. He copied it from the deaf students' signs. And some that they used, he learned from them. And, he had the Cistercian monks that had taken a vow of silence to create signs according to the French grammar. And what he called a sign system or methodical sign. It was also known as the French method. That became sort of the basis for the future of French Sign Language. When the French school was established, there was many well-educated deaf students there that went to that school in Paris. And they set up their own French banquet in Paris called the Paris Banquets. And that was sort of the golden era of deaf community. It's interesting that many of the deaf people in Paris who were educated were very well respected by the Paris community and the Paris government individually. The Marquis and all those other government people were very respected. They would go to the deaf banquets and they would have deaf people to come speak and show their different philosophies and show their politics and different things, and they would get together and discuss things. It was really amazing. There was a lot of well-informed people that were invited to those banquets. So there was many different lectures that were translated to French and printed out. And it was funny because there was a lot of hearing people there, and they were just sort of awed by the knowledge that those deaf people had. And they were able to go sort of head to head and have debates and different things. And they were able to ask questions and ask for advice from deaf people. Like, hey, how can you set up this or this thing about this law or this thing about politics? And they were able to approach and ask questions of the deaf people before they would run for government. After the 1870s, deaf people founded 11 deaf schools and they ran them themselves. They edited and owned several city newspapers in Europe. They became artists, famous artists, writers, publishers. Some even fought and died in the French Revolution as soldiers. They were able to join, participate in French politics in the French Revolution. At that time in Paris, it was sort of required for just about everybody to learn sign language. But I mean, it didn't happen, but it's nice that they were all trying. Now, going over to America, during the 1690s, there was many deaf people that lived in the southeastern part of England, and they had immigrated to the US, and many of them settled in Martha's Vineyard. That's an island there. It's near Cape Cod, just around the little bend there. And specifically in the town of Chilmark. And according to the 1880s US Census, it showed that there is one deaf person per 6,000 persons in the US. But there in Martha's Vineyard, there was as many as 1 in 155 for the whole island that was deaf. But in the town of Chilmark, it was about 1 in 25. So that means there was a very high percentage of deaf people there, and many deaf that lived on Martha's Vineyard. So everyone who lived there on that island knew sign language, hearing and deaf both. Everyone could sign at that time. So that was also thought of as the golden age also. Chilmark, the sign language there in that town, was later known as Martha's Vineyard sign language. And it was for the deaf and hearing people on the island. And also it was accepted as just as ASL is today. And then also there's evidence that shows that Native American Indian Sign Language was used by the hearing people also, and it was sort of incorporated into Martha's Vineyard Sign Language also. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was offered by Dr. Mason Cogswell to travel to England to learn how to teach deaf students, since he had a deaf daughter. Her name was Alice Cogswell. You see, that's the picture there. That's a statue there. The little girl, that's Alice. And then Thomas Gallaudet is there with her. They're sitting there together. 1815, Gallaudet got in a boat and traveled to England. He went to the Briarwood Academy in England. It was a private school. And they sort of rejected Gallaudet because they wanted money and wanted Gallaudet to stay there for several years to learn their methods, and they couldn't afford that. So, they wanted him to stay several years in England and just sort of learn their method and everything about how the way they do it. But at that time in England was very strong in the oral method and did not use sign language. So he was sort of struggling with that. But fortunately, he traveled to France and met the man Leclerc at Paris Institute in France. He went to that town there after England, and then went back to England and showed them and taught them the method there. And that's where they met Gallaudet. The man from France had traveled to England. And he met him, Leclerc, and Thomas Gallaudet, and they learned French Sign Language and the way that they did things. And so they invited him to come to France, Gallaudet, 1816, and to sort of observe the French method of teaching at the National Institute there in France. And he would learn and pick it up. In 1817, as his time was running out, he had to come back. And he asked Leclerc, said, "Can you come to America with me, with Thomas Gallaudet, and establish a new school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut?" And Leclerc thought about it and decided, okay, sure. I can come and stay for a few years and help them get established there in America and teach, and then come back to France. So they decided to do that. So they both got in the boat and went sailing. And, at that time, it took maybe like a month or even more to get across the ocean. Today, you can just go immediately. That travels much faster nowadays. But Gallaudet taught him English and how to learn to read and write English. And then Leclerc taught him French Sign Language. So they sort of had an exchange of languages on their way there. And then they went to Connecticut and established the first school for the deaf in Connecticut for educating the deaf and teaching the deaf and dumb persons how to speak. Now it's been renamed. It's just called the American School for the Deaf now. At that time, the word dumb just meant you couldn't speak. It was like the same word as mute. It didn't have the same connotation as it does now, meaning someone unintelligent. At that time, there was many different languages that would have to be translated at that time. So it was sort of accepted. But that word dumb is not accepted today. It's not used. It's sort of an old-fashioned word, and we don't use it anymore. You're muted, Dan.
We were just switching interpreters, and I happened to be muted accidentally. Thank you, Andrew. All right. So at that time, many deaf schools were set up in different states and followed Connecticut's example. In New York in 1818, Pennsylvania 1820, Kentucky 1823, Ohio 1827, Virginia 1838, Indiana in 1843. They follow that same methods, that same approach of teaching ASL that had been established in Connecticut. And now that's referred to as the bilingual bimodal approach, where you teach American Sign Language as well as English at the same time, specifically reading and writing in English. Some choose to speak, some do not, but the goal is reading and writing in English as well as sign language. And then in 1864, the Collegiate Department of Columbia, of the Columbia Institute for the Deaf and Dumb, was established in Washington, D.C. It was later renamed to Gallaudet University and still is today. Edward Minor Gallaudet, that is Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet's son. He was the first president of the university. And he served there in 15 years starting in 1864. Fast forwarding to 1880, there was a massive international conference called the Second International Congress for the Education of the Deaf, and this happened in Milan, Italy, colloquially known as the Milan Conference. Now, there were 164 delegates in attendance, and out of that 164 delegates, there's only one individual who is deaf from Washington, D.C., from the Kendall School. He was the Kendall School principal. His name was James Dennison. Now, during the debates and proposals for that Milan conference, they proposed that the oral method should be the preference, and the manual method, sign language, should be rejected. This passed with only 6 folks opposing, only 6 delegates opposing. And 5 out of those 6 are from America. And of course, one was the deaf man, James Dennison, Edward Minor Gallaudet, and his brother, Thomas Gallaudet. Isaac Lewis Peat, Charles Stoddard, and the last one here was this Englishman named Richard Elliot, a British teacher. So it was just the 6 of them in opposition who thought that the manual method should sustain. Now, this decision had massive consequences for the education of deaf folks from 1880 all the way still to today. Before that, many deaf schools in America, maybe 60% had deaf instructors, deaf teachers in those schools. I'll move my slide here. After that conference, it had a sharp decline. The amount of deaf instructors went way down. The deaf folks in administration were removed. Like I said before, I went from about 50 to 60%, all the way down to less than 5%. Now, and the only ones who were there could just speak, not knowing sign language. Many of the deaf folks of high level employment or creative employment, like painters or publishers or anything like that, went sharply down as well. Instead, having to revert to manual labor jobs like factory workers or working at print shops or things like that. This had a huge change. Deaf people with access to language sharply declined as well. And that's referred to language deprivation and how that impacts the deaf community. And the effect of colonialism here reduced the deaf communities to a kind of subsistence level. Colonized, this is the sign for it, as grabbing both the head and the heart. Sort of taking over the mind and taking over the soul of the community, removing their own communities in order to be part of the mainstream community of hearing culture. Now, around that same time, there was the manual versus oral debate in deaf education at around 1880 as well. Edward Minor Gallaudet was a strong supporter of using sign language in educating the deaf. He was a beautiful signer. He was very fluent in the language. It was very impressive. Now, his opposition was Alexander Graham Bell. He was a strong supporter of the oral method. He did not support the use of the manual method, even though he was a fluent ASL user himself, and his mother was deaf, and his wife was deaf. His father, Alexander Graham Bell's, he was the sort of a huge proponent and inventor of the oral method in the United States, and sort of speech therapy, proposed using speech therapy as well. So you have Gallaudet and Bell going sort of head to head here, and they would have confrontations in Washington D.C. In public spaces and debates, constantly going back and forth, debating with one another. And because of that, Edward Minor Gallaudet established the Convention of American Instructors of the Deaf there was a publication, an educational publication in the U.S., American Annals for the Deaf. He set that up. And then Bell later on set up the Volta Bureau in 1887, which is known today as the Alexander Graham Bell Association of the Deaf. Bell tried to erase deaf identity, claiming that we should try ourselves to forget that they are deaf. We should try to teach them to forget that they are deaf. That's a quote. Really showing, succinctly his preference for the oral method. And he wanted deaf people to look like hearing people and act like hearing people, even though they were, of course, not. Now, moving away from history, I'd like to talk about ASL as a language in general, holistically. ASL, as I mentioned before, the North American Indian Sign Languages, there were 7 geographic regions, each of which had its own tribal sign language. And when European colonization occurred, there was a language genocide with tribal spoken and signed languages. And so there's no record of those Indian Sign Languages, and that piece of linguistic history is largely lost now. Now, the big question, is ASL language? Yes. Now, Martha's Vineyard is when sign language was, quote unquote, born. In Paris, at that deaf school, as I talked about with Gallaudet, and how he went with Leclerc and learned French Sign Language there, they came back to the United States and set up Martha's Vineyard. And that became sort of Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. And where Clare and Gallaudet established that Hartford, Connecticut School for the Deaf there. And there was Indian Sign Language, and then there was Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, and there was French Sign Language. All 3 of them sort of got mixed up in this sort of linguistic soup that we know as American Sign Language today. Early bilingual education of using ASL and English in deaf schools before the Milan Conference was sort of established here. Now, remember, after 1880, I call that the Dark Ages for the deaf community and for deaf education, where we had that sharp decline in use of American Sign Language. And at deaf schools, they were just teaching the oral method. And people still were learning ASL in their dorms or behind the teachers' backs. Deaf students who had deaf families still passed down that language. A small percentage, maybe about less than 10% of those of deaf children have deaf parents. So, bringing that language to school to teach other deaf students American Sign Language was done behind instructors' backs and not publicly encouraged, but encouraged privately. About 80 years later, in 1960, a linguist, Dr. William Stoke, he went to Gallaudet University to teach, and through his observations, saw that the deaf students were showing there was patterns, there was grammatical structures in their language use, and he decided that American Sign Language was a language, period, full stop. Now, at that time, ASL was generally believed to be a corrupt visual code of English or elaborate pantomime. That and other national sign languages were widely suppressed in educational programs for deaf students. It happened in France, in Germany, all over Europe, in America, in favor of reading lips and speaking. So Dr. Stoke, he proposed that ASL was in fact a fully formed human language in the same sense as spoken languages, just like English, just like French, just like German, just like Greek, any other language. Dr. Stoke he was researching with Carl Kronberg, as well as Dorothy Casterline. The three of them together, the two of them were deaf, and Stokey was hearing. They published this classic paper called "A Dictionary in American Sign Language" in 1965. People at that time mocked them. They thought they were ridiculous, but they held fast. And now ASL has achieved a formal recognition as a language. At that time, they identified 19 hand shapes, 12 locations, and 24 movements that were presented in sign language. Now, hand shapes is what the hand is doing, like 1, 5, 4, looks kind of like this, like an 8 hand shape or a B hand shape. Location, either on the body or near the body, either on the forehead or the chin or on the chest. The change of location changes the meaning. Same with the hand shape. So, for example, let me think. Happy, like this, or depressed, different hand shape, but same location, changes the meaning. And also the movement can change the meaning as well. For example, the sign for name versus the sign for short changes the meaning just based on the movement, but the hand shape and the location is the same. Further research by linguists have found that ASL can be examined at all levels of linguistic analysis. First, phonology. ASL has 5 parameters At that time, in 1965, it was thought to be 3, but turns out there's actually 5 that we've discovered now. Hand shape, movement, location, the 3 that we've talked about, as well as palm orientation, and non-manual markers. So non-manual markers refers to what the face is doing, what the eyes are doing, what the body is doing. Those are all non-manual markers. Morphology, ASL has its own morphology. It's not broken down by sound, but it's broken down by visuals. Syntax as well, so your grammar structure, it does not follow English grammar. It does not follow English word order either. Typically, the structure is topic, comment, or object, subject, verb. So really, the grammar follows more similarly to Spanish. You can think of it like that instead of English. And discourse as well, with various visual and gestural communications. If one person looks away, that can be seen as rude. Just like, if you were to cover your ears when someone's trying to talk to you, that would be seen as rude. So maintaining eye gaze is important. American Sign Language is a gestural visual language. It is not an auditory language. So it doesn't matter what the modality of the language is. What matters more is that it has all of the elements that a language needs to have. So when talking about what proves something to be a language or not, what needs to be satisfied for something to be considered a language formally, ASL all languages need to be a system of symbols and grammatical signals. So ASL checks all of those boxes. Hand shapes, has patterns, has different grammatical structures, and has its own syntax. Languages must be shared by members of a community. Yes, ASL is shared by the deaf community. At deaf schools, deaf families, so it checks that box. Third, it must have relatively arbitrary symbols. So, for example, some signs might look iconic, like tree. The sign for tree looks relatively like a tree, but if you were to sign philosophy or idea or intelligent or hungry or many, any number of other signs that are not iconic, that are much more arbitrary. So that fulfills that requirement of having relatively arbitrary symbols. Languages must be able to change across time. So if you think about Old English, thou shalt not, things like that, that has clearly changed to today's language. ASL has as well. So the first sign for telephone looked like this. The old hand crank telephone, and then it turned into the sort of Y hand shape with the thumb and the pinky, and now it's sort of the C hand shape of holding an iPhone, right? So that has clearly shown change over time as a quick example. So it checks that box. Language must be used for several purposes: to interact with each other, to communicate ideas, emotions, and intentions. ASL does that too. And lastly, it must be used by members of the community to transmit culture from generation to generation. So we have deaf culture, and through the generations, the deaf community and through deaf families, that culture has been passed down from generation to generation. And I think we're going to switch interpreters.
So his work really created a lot of research and a lot of linguistic studies about many different publications that he did that prove that ASL is a language. It follows grammar, it follows syntax. Gallaudet University right now, they have what's called their Visual Language and Visual Learning Lab. V2L is what they call it. That really continues to explore ASL in depth. You can check that out there, the link there in the PowerPoint. You can do a little more research if you want, maybe learn some more. Now, since ASL has been passed down through the culture, you have to look at it through a cultural lens. You know how you have to put different things in perspective and look at things through the proper lens, and through the history and socialization, and different ways that it's sort of the same, follows some parallels that women's studies did, Black studies, Latino studies, also LGBTQ plus studies. There's a lot of similarities because of the sort of colonialism and trying to sort of push out the perspective and trying to force in Alexander Graham Bell's same perspective and wanting to really remove ASL from sort of the whole culture. And also, they encouraged deaf people not to marry other deaf people. At that time, it was viewed as nativism, sort of like it was strange and different. And there was a lot of immigrants that were moving from Europe to America at that time. And because it was still the 1800s and people were really concerned and they didn't know what to do. So there was a lot of really discrimination, a lot of oppression, and there was some genocide. So you really just have to think of the deaf community in the same parallel as some of these other groups of people. So deaf-blind, and hard of hearing experiences. They experience autism, which is that word, and then there's linguism, and it's just the behavior of speaking like a hearing person and saying that's better than those who don't speak. Saying those who speak verbally is a higher up or more important than those that don't speak verbally. That's autism. And then there's linguism, which recognizes that one language is superior than another language. Um, and I had a situation, I've seen that before where they think that English is superior to ASL, sort of like what Alexander Graham Bell's organization does. But really, if you think about it, A.G. Bell basically, he really hated a group of people in that organization. They're trying to force out and just sort of, create genocide on a specific language. And that's sort of my view on it. But moving down, we have deafhood. Many deaf people go through what's called really a process of really learning about themselves. And really oftentimes, as we've mentioned before, 90% of deaf children are born with hearing parents. And out of that 90%, probably about 90% do not learn sign language. The parents do not. So that means that their communication with their deaf children is very much hindered, and they struggle. And that's sort of where a sensitivity and a focus can be on the visual aspects of things. And that's where deaf people also use the eyes. They're called people of the eyes because they don't have ears, so everything comes in through their eyes. Also, there's deaf space, like designing a building or a deaf school, and really wanting to have an open space, an open area where you can really see each other. Because You know, people of the eyes, like I said, if you're trying to get somebody's attention and they're maybe across the room, but if there's, one room here, there's a lot of walls here or walls there, you can't see each other and you can't communicate verbally. So they like to often, deaf people like to have an open floor space, and especially open floor plans, maybe if they're home or office, just something that you can see each other a lot easier. The last one there is called deaf gain, which means looking at themselves in a positive aspect, not as in a negative way. Like, for example, if you go to a dance club and the music going doo, 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 the music, and you don't have any problem talking with my friends across the room. We can just sign. The music's blasting, and hearing people are like right next to each other. They say, what was that? What did you say? And they have to go outside to have a chat. But deaf people can go into the club and it doesn't matter if the music's blaring, they can still have a conversation. So that's what we call deaf gain. That's focusing on the positive aspects of not being able to hear, and sort of not feeling like we've lost anything, but sort of being like, hey, guess what? We've gained something. You can go scuba diving. Deaf people can go scuba diving, go down under the water, and we can still have a full regular conversation right there under the water. That'd be hard for hearing people. You drowned, if you took your thing and tried to speak, but we can sign under the water. And we can understand each other just fine. And that's deaf gain. That's deaf gain. So I encourage you to learn ASL here at ETSU so you can be a part of that. So deaf culture includes a linguistic and cultural group. It recognizes social norms and values that are passed down from one generation to another. ASL, as a primary means of communication and language, is a human right, and to call it as a first language. The United Nations has a committee for disabled people, and they recognize ASL and other sign languages of the world. ASL is not an international sign language. It's only used Canada and the United States. That's the only two places it's really used. France, they have their own sign language. Japan has their own sign language. So Russia has its own sign language. Just about every country has their own sign language, their own grammar, their own structure, completely separate signs, and they use it visually. So, but it is recognized from birth, because the first word, if you speak to a deaf child, but their first year for a hearing baby, they can still hear. They're learning language immediately, but their vocal cords are not developed yet. So their brain is ready, but they can't really speak yet. Their vocal cords are not developed till maybe one, maybe a little bit before one. That's the first time they can say their first words like mama or dada, milk. But for deaf children, deaf babies, because of their skills, their motor skills are developed enough, probably about 6 months, they can start signing. And they can sign their first word. They can sign mama or dada or milk. And it's probably not exactly the correct sign, but it's close. So they start learning their language and they can start expressing their language earlier than hearing children. That's why they encourage, you see a lot of baby sign language books and things like that. But you really should encourage hearing children to sign as early as possible. But also, they take away the language of a human right from the deaf children. So it's just really a juxtaposition about that, because they're trying to give sign language to hearing children, but take it away from deaf children. ASL, there's arts, values, beliefs, behaviors, demonstrates strong heritage. Also, it values multicultural identities. Like, for example, ASL in itself also has sort of, I would say, subgroups, sublanguages. There's BASL, which is Black ASL. A long time ago, when there was Jim Crow laws, when there was segregation, there would be, you know how they had white students and black students separated. They also had white deaf students and black deaf students segregated. Probably, before the 60s and all that, before the civil rights movement. So there, when they were segregated at the black deaf schools, their sign language is a little bit different than the sign language at the white deaf school. There's like certain things, there's signs like this, but they would sign those things at the black deaf school. So there's many different examples of differences, small differences in the language and values. And they're finding all this stuff through research. Probably about 10 years ago, there was some publications about Black ASL, and it's been recognized by many different through many different cultural identities. So here's some labels and identities. So I prefer to call myself deaf with a capital D. If it's a lowercase d, that just means someone who's not culturally deaf. They're just auditorily deaf. They're not somebody that's part of the deaf community. They're just sort of from an audiological perspective, they're deaf, not from a cultural perspective. The same as deaf blind. There's big D deaf blind and little d deaf blind. Like, for example, Hispanic, they'll do a capital H, or Asians will have a capital A for Asian. Black, some have a capital B. It's sort of the same identity. It just means you're culturally that, and you can use sign language. The other term, there's hard of hearing. And there's a medical term, unilateral, which means they're deaf. You can be deaf in one ear. My son is unilateral. He's deaf in one ear. Bilateral means deaf in both ears, profoundly deaf. And there's mild, there's moderate, there's profound. Now, here's some labels that aren't accepted anymore. Remember, we were talking about deaf mute. They would used to say mute. It just meant somebody that couldn't speak, or deaf and dumb. That's some old language. Now those are very, very negative. We don't use those at all. They're also hearing impaired. That is not the proper terminology. That was created by hearing people. That was not created by the deaf community. No one ever asked the deaf community, oh, we better not call them deaf. We better call them hearing impaired. That was not created by the deaf community. That was by hearing people. And, I would say that we're not hearing impaired. You're signing impaired. That'll fix it, if you don't know sign language. Because they're in Paris and different places say, oh, I'm not hearing impaired, but they're fascinated with the deaf in Paris and learning sign language there at those banquets. So they would say that they're signing impaired. There's hearing loss. Some people say trouble with hearing. That's kind of a negative thing too. We prefer to say deaf or hard of hearing. Those are the two most widely accepted in terms. Again, please refrain from using the term hearing impaired. Doesn't even matter what their hearing status is. It's not, it sort of makes it seem like that person's not normal if they're impaired. Now I'm going to teach you how to get the attention of a deaf person. Because me, if you're behind me and you holler out something, I'm not going to hear you. I'm not going to turn around. So a better way is, if you're behind me, tap me on the shoulder or on the arm. That's proper in our culture. Maybe 2 or 3, like tap, tap, tap. That's just sort of the proper form. And I'll turn and look. Oh, okay, hi, Or maybe if I'm way in front or you're coming at me and you wave or shake your hand like this, And the closer you get, you can wave. If you're really far away, you can wave like this, really big. So the closer you are, if you're really close, you wouldn't want to wave really big. But doing a little wave, that's perfectly fine to get people's attention. Now, if you don't understand a person, if they're signing, what do you do? There's many different ways you can visually communicate. You can get a piece of paper and a pen and write down notes. You can gesture, or you can just point to things. If there's an interpreter there, grab the interpreter and use the interpreter, like Andrew right here. There's so many resources. There's so many books you can read. Here's just a couple suggestions. There's Deaf Utopia. That's by Niall DeMarco. Remember, he won Dancing with the Stars. He's now an author too. There's some other that talk about language deprivation, because deaf education, after the different meanings, they talk about the oral way, but a lot of words don't show up until they're 5 or 6. A lot of times they don't learn language and they're behind the 8 ball already because they don't start learning language when they're first born. So that's language deprivation. Not the same as hearing children where they start learning English immediately. Here's some basic signs I'm going to show you real quick. Here's hello. There's bye. How are you? Me, I'm good. Me, I'm fine. I'm so-so. You can say I'm awful. You can say my name, and then you can spell your name, Lenny. How can I help you? Don't understand. Understand. Help me, please. There's a sign for deaf, hard of hearing, hearing, where, bathroom, classroom, water, ASL, or you can say sign language. And then the last one, nice to meet you. Okay, I know time's running out. Just got like 2 minutes left. Is there any questions?
I don't have any questions. I just more so have comments.
Have called Deaf Talk. It's going to be in the Culp Center, in the ballroom. It's at 5:30 this Thursday, 5:30 to 7, and we'll have interpreters there. And it's going to be for deaf people from this area, from this community, to share their stories, their personal stories. Some are sad, some are funny, some are inspiring stories. And if y'all are interested in coming, please come. It'll be this Thursday, at the ballroom in the Culp Center at 5:30. So y'all come on. We'll have free food too. Free food. That's a positive.
Thank you.